Hello, and welcome to Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager. I'm pleased to have with me back on the show once again, Autumn Edwards. Welcome to the show, Autumn.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so last time I had Autumn on, we talked about modern Japanese auteurs, which prompted her and I to have long conversations about all sorts of Japanese cinema and other Asian cinema that we have 100 different ideas for future episodes on. And one of them we're deciding to do now, which is the films of Wong Kar-Wai. I'm calling it part one because we're going chronologically with his filmography starting at the beginning. And so there's enough films that we could do a part two because you'll see, for those who are familiar with those films, we're not going to be talking about some of his most famous films like In the Mood for Love, since we're going chronologically. What prompted this is that I think Autumn, and remind me about this, but he's one of your favorite filmmakers. Is that correct?
Certainly, yeah. And Chungking Express in particular, and In the Mood for Love. But since Chungking is the subject today, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. So
Probably top 10, would you say?
I would say top one to two, probably just
Top one. Top one is just favorite of all time.
by
So
virtue of
yeah.
rewatch. It's so hard to choose though, a single one. So
And maybe you could talk a little bit before we delve in here about Wong Kar-Wai's style, what he's known for as a filmmaker, and what kind of put him on the map as an
Mhm.
auteur.
Yeah, gladly. So Wong Kar-Wai is a very stylistic filmmaker. He's one of the most I think romantic, kind of sensual, not necessarily in an overtly sexy way, but he really conveys yearning very well, and like lust. His movies are bathed in, gorgeous, gorgeous colors usually. They're just a very romantic sensibility. And in addition to that, though, his earlier stuff is often compared to like MTV style stuff because stylistically, I think like he edits a lot of his stuff kind of like with a music video mentality almost. Many sections of his films play off like little music videos in the middle of a movie, which is really fun. They wrap you up and sweep you along, and he's just a very emotional director, I suppose.
Hmm.
Evocative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
warm and sensual, and I agree, like the MTV style, not in a bad way because his films don't feel choppy, but he does edit a lot with music in mind, I think, and
hmm
definitely has that feeling of, for instance, we'll see this in some of the films we're going to talk about, that the music, the soundtrack of a certain character will appear quite a bit. So he is someone who is kind of a film lover's director in a way, like
hmm
it's a thing, like if someone's into Wong Kar-Wai, you know that they are a true film fan. I feel like that's one of the marks of a true film fan. And unfortunately hasn't made any films in recent years, but I think you said he is working on a TV series
hmm
um, over in Hong Kong. Is it in Hong Kong?
Blossoms of Shanghai is what it's called. It's a very big project, apparently.
Oh, wow. So we should dive right in. We're going to go in chronological order. I think this will make it interesting, especially once we get to part two in a future episode, to see how he's evolved or changed as a filmmaker over time. A couple of these I had not seen before. Well, one in particular, our very first one, which I'll kick off here, is As Tears Go By, his first feature film from 1988. It was about a small time gang member who tries to keep his kind of screwed up friend out of trouble. Very much inspired by Scorsese's Mean Streets, which, even if you didn't read that on Wikipedia as I was watching it, I was thinking this plot's a little bit like Mean Streets, with the addition of the great Maggie Chung as the love interest, who is his cousin in this film, who comes to visit him while she's in town for a medical procedure, but then they end up sort of falling in love. But as is typical with Wong Kar-Wai, one of the main themes of his films is unrequited love. And because the main character of Wah, I'm hoping that's how I'm saying his right name correctly. If I'm not, please correct me. the main character, he keeps getting sidetracked. He kind of keeps wanting to go back to her, but then every time he does, his friend does something else to screw up something with these kind of other hoodlums they're involved with, and so he keeps having to go back to like save his friend. What
Mhm.
I thought was interesting about this being so familiar with more of his later films is that you really see him just starting to develop his style here. And of course, working with actors like Maggie Chung, who he worked with a lot throughout his career. But here he has more of a much more conventional story than I think you see in his later films, and a lot more kind of like action pieces, which is not something he's necessarily known for, with the hoodlums like beating each other up and pulling
Mhm.
knives on each other and stuff like that, which is not really the Wong Kar-Wai that a lot of people know. So that was very interesting to me. Curious to hear your take on it. Had you seen this one before?
I had actually just seen it for the first time earlier this year. So rewatching it was very nice. I got like a better feel for it and what he was doing. I think this is probably the one that feels the most MTV-like if we were to go with anything, just because of the subject matter, right? Like down on the streets with the gangs, and the way he shoots things is much more fast-paced. The editing is faster, the cuts come faster. And the way he like uses the neon lights and stuff in particular feels very influential or influenced by MTV.
Hmm.
Um, and like you said, I felt the Mean Streets connection in this one too. But it feels like it's kind of a different take on the Mean Streets story.
Hmm.
This one's much more romantic and, again, everything we know Wong Kar-Wai for, whereas Mean Streets is much more like a spiritual search.
Yeah,
And this
exactly.
one
Well, there's
is,
like no women in Mean Streets, so I
yeah,
mean,
there
very
no
few.
exactly. That's a big
Yeah.
difference already. Yeah. And
Yeah,
so I
so
thought
that
it
is a
was,
big difference. I guess the main thing with the friend, Fly, is the name of his friend who's a screw up, who's kind of akin to the Robert De Niro character in Mean Streets, right? Is like constantly trying to keeping him out of trouble. It's like a friend
mhm,
that's almost more like a brother. In fact, I think he calls him his brother a lot in this film. But
mhm.
no matter what he does, his friend just keeps like getting himself into trouble and doing stupid things.
Yeah.
Um, so, but
Because of
but
his
it.
relationship, he's just like unable to, extricate himself from his friend, and so he's pulled down with him inevitably. And I think it's a lot about the brotherly bonds and the fallibility of that sort of blind loyalty or what have you.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So probably, definitely not peak Wong Kar-wai, but you already see some great promising aspects, I think, and you definitely already see his themes of unrequited love, yearning, particularly the very end shot, which I don't want to give away for people who haven't seen it. This one is part of, and I should mention this right up the top, that Criterion has put out a box set called The World of Wong Kar-wai, where you can find a lot of his films, and many of them are on the Criterion channel as well if you don't want to go out and buy the massive box set. This one is in there. Not all of the films he's made are in that box set, which is interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but just noting that for people who are wondering how they can find these movies. So,
Yeah.
okay,
I
so
think what I
you want to,
was Oh
yeah, go
yeah, I
ahead.
just wanted to say one more thing. I think I was most impressed with this one, like how fully formed Wong Kar-wai comes onto the scene. Like even though you can tell this is a less mature work and it's prodding like less questions and et cetera. It's a more conventional narrative, but stylistically he's basically all there. He adds a few tricks to his bag over time and everything, but he's very in control here already. Like it's
Hmm.
pretty amazing, and all of his like penchants are already in here. Like you
Yeah,
said, the
it's true.
memory and unrequited love, and like even little specific plot points or things like spiking a drink or what have you. There's a lot of different things that are just repeated throughout his filmography that are already present here in the very first film, and it's really, really fascinating to look at it with that sort of hindsight.
Yeah, and while not as sumptuous in terms of colors as his later films, the kind of the deepness of the colors, particularly in Mood like in The Mood for Love, which I still think is one of the most beautiful movies ever made, just visually.
Hmm.
But this one, he's already using, and you'll have to start with your film knowledge here from your film school, those kind of the slow mo thing he does,
The
which is sort
step
of like the
printing.
blurred. What is it called?
It's called step printing. Yeah, it's
Step
where they
printing.
like, yeah, I believe the process is they take like a single frame and they will overlay that one frame on the next like several frames. And so it creates sort of like almost like a two frame rates within the single frame feeling where, the subjects that are moving less look almost completely static and the ones that are moving are like this fluid, beautiful, moving blob.
Right.
It sounds like a really bad way to describe it, but
Yeah, I
it's
was
totally
calling it almost
gorgeous.
slow-mo, but that's not the right. Yeah, step printing. So he uses that in action sequences here, which I thought was really interesting. So rather than speeding up, which we're used to in like action hero, like superhero movies today, it's the opposite. It's almost like slowed down, but yet not at the same time. So yeah, it's a very interesting visual style that he uses throughout his career, and we see it right here in his first
Hmm.
film. So that's kind of cool to see. Okay, well, we should move on because we definitely want to spend the most time on the next two films. So.
Absolutely. So, Days of Being Wild is Wong Kar-Wai's second feature. This one is actually the first of a thematic trilogy that includes this, In the Mood for Love, and 2046. Many of the characters are repeated throughout those three movies, maybe not necessarily the exact same character with the same history, but they carry some similar characteristics, and the names are often repeated. And I think that like the meanings that are built, through the characters in each movie, and the way that they interplay is really interesting. But this one I think is the first look at like a more, Wong Kar-wai that we're used to in terms of
Hmm.
it's a period piece in the 60s in Hong Kong. It's much more slowed down. It's much less volatile than as tears go by. He's taking his time here and slowing things back, and it's another story of a guy, pursuing a girl and the unrequited love. But this time, he's a player, and he's not necessarily the most trustworthy guy. And there's not a ton of plot here, but what's interesting, I think, is just like the the NUI, just like the little things, and the moments that you sit with the characters as they react to the things that are happening to them. And like I think that's the most Wong Kar-wai stuff we get because it's so human.
And again, we have him working with actors he would work with throughout his career. Leslie Chung in the lead role, Maggie Chung again, and then of course Tony Leung, who one of our favorite actors, you and me, and he's in most of Wong Kar-wai's films. So great to see all those actors on the screen. It's interesting on this one. It had been a while since I'd seen it. And this one in the box set, at least for Criterion, is has been redone to have this kind of green filter on it, which in some scenes I thought looked pretty cool, like in some of the
Hmm.
interior shots, and in some of the exterior shots I thought seemed odd, almost like people have like looked sick a little bit. Christopher Doyle is his longtime cinematographer who worked with Wong Kar-wai, and apparently this is the way they wanted it to look, and they weren't allowed to for the original distribution. So I know there's a lot of controversy about that. Not wanting to spend a lot of time on that, I will say one of the things that's interesting about this is the lead character, who's this playboy, right? He has all these beautiful women who want to be with him, and in typical Wong Kar-wai fashion, just never really finds any sort of resolution with any of them, despite the fact that he has all this chance at love. Instead of focused on that, he's kind of obsessed with this idea that he was adopted and trying to find his real adoptive parents. And so rather than, again, being focused on the present of these two different women who are in love with him and maybe focus on developing a relationship, instead he's focused on this idea of something in the past or a memory of these parents he
Hmm.
never knew, and obsessed with that idea. So again, it's
Hmm.
sort of this idea, like you mentioned, where he's obsessed with memory and the past and things that are out of their control, really, rather than being focused on the present.
Hmm. Yeah, I think memory is the most central theme among Wong Kar-wai's entire filmography. So I think this one's like very important because it's the first one to introduce that so centrally. And he also starts using a lot more like poetic devices, I think, and like little gestures like the glass that Maggie Chung hides and stuff. And, the obsession with like the single minute and the way they do the voiceovers, they're just like these great one-liners that just like sit with you and they're beautifully written and everything. And it feels so Wong Kar-wai. It's really amazing.
Yeah, he is a director that breaks the rules in terms of he uses voiceover a lot in his movies, and film critics will say that that's usually the sign of lazy writing, but then they love his movies, and so I think he's one of the ones that gets away with it, partially because of the removal, the way he removes his characters and has this idea that you're almost like always viewing them through this looking back. So the
Hmm.
the voiceover seems to work somehow and not be distracting the
Yeah.
way it can in other films,
His
like
characters
The
are very
Killer.
like solipsistic, and so they're like constantly looking inward, and a lot of the time the narration is just like their own thoughts as they reflect on things. And
Hmm.
again, like he uses the narration for a lot of like poetic license, and just terms of certain phrases that he'll drop in and certain things that he'll tie into other things visually. Again, like the obsession with the single minute that Leslie Chung tells Maggie, like, oh, you're gonna remember this 1 minute for the rest of your life,
Yeah,
and then he starts showing clocks everywhere, and other things like that.
yeah. I want to make sure we have time for your favorite film of all time
Yeah,
because we have to
absolutely.
spend the
Yeah.
most time on that. So why don't you introduce our next one?
So Chungking Express is his third film. I think it's, one of the greatest films of all time. This one's really interesting because it should have been technically his fourth film, but because of production issues, it actually ended up being his third. He filmed it during the post-production of Ashes of Time, which is now his fourth because the release was later. Over the course of, I believe, like 2 months of filming and 1 month post-production, which is absolutely insane. But I think it's one of the most perfect movies of all time. It's a diptych of like two cops pursuing women that they have kind of an obsession with, although in the second story it's a little inverted. But it's just another story of unrequited love and just heavy romanticism. And I think it's just one of the most fun movies of all time too.
It has two stories, which you and I talked about. That one, here's the thing that he does that I think is very tricky. He starts with this first character of this first cop who is obsessed with a woman who left him named May, and then becomes involved with this kind of mysterious woman played by Bridget Lynn, right? And then you're kind of like, oh, this, if you're watching it for the first time, you might think this is the story we're following now. And then just, he kind of just drops that one at some point and focuses on the romance with the second cop, played by Tony Leung, one of the great actors of our time. And he was also getting over the loss of his girlfriend, who's a flight attendant, and starts to develop, I guess, some attention from Faye Wong, who you informed me is was a pop star, right, in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And like you said, it's inverted. He's amused and kind of interested in the Faye Wong character, but she's the one who's actually obsessed with him in this case, and trying to get his attention. And sort of gradually over time, she's like, a lot of the fun sequences is she's sneaking into his apartment to like clean it and make it better, and he's so oblivious
Hmm.
he doesn't even realize it. So there's a lot of humor in this one, which you don't always think of in all of his films, particularly in the more serious romantic ones like In the Mood for Love. I like that this one has a lightness and that there's a lot of humor in it.
Hmm.
It's also just a gorgeous movie to look at. The colors are sumptuous, the scenes are dizzying, it's romantic and fun, and probably one of his, I don't know if you'd be willing to say this, but I think it's his most optimistic film too.
Oh, I think so too, far and away. Yeah. I mean, it's about the only one where there's any sort of happy ending that I can think of.
Right. And
Like,
also interesting that he shot it on the side, like, oh, I'm just waiting for Ashes of Time to get done. So I'll just shoot this little thing. It was almost, I don't want to say throwaway, but it's definitely not,
mhm.
and then it turns out to be one of his best films, if
Yeah,
not the
it's a
best
movie of
film he
like
ever
pure
made.
serendipity in like every way, in the way that it came together. I mean, it took so many random coincidences for this movie to happen the way it did. Like so much of the actual structure of the film even was informed because they were shooting it on the fly. They didn't have a script or anything, and they were just making it up as they went along. So much of the script was made up according to things like their schedules. Like originally, Wong Kar-Wai wanted the four main characters to be in scenes together and to share, the screen together, but we never got that because their schedules just didn't line up. And so
Hmm.
that led into the two, more separated diptychs and everything. And then it's actually shot by two different cinematographers for the two different stories. The first one's Andrew Lau, who shot also As Tears Go By. And then the second one is Christopher Doyle. And the
Oh, I
second
didn't
one,
realize that.
yeah, right, because they're very similar, but I think you can tell like some slight differences when you watch them. Christopher Doyle's is a little bit more of that light airiness I think that we associate with the
Hmm.
movie, the kind of dance-like rhythm to the camera.
Yeah.
It feels like his camera is like choreographing a dance with the actors. But yeah, in addition to the gorgeous look and cinematography of this movie, I think one of the great joys of it is just it's a very it's called like shoegaze cinema by a lot of people, which I totally get. It's not a ton of plot. It's mostly a film about vibes. It's mostly about just the emotions you feel while you're in the given moment. And I think a lot of the fun of this film comes from just the random associations that you come up with as you compare the two stories and you just like think about what these people are saying and how they're interacting with their environments. And I think that's one of my favorite things also about this movie. It's one of the great films that like makes the setting very much a character, like
Hmm.
in the sense that even Tony Leung starts to talk to inanimate objects around his apartment and treat it as if it's a living thing. The apartment cries when it floods and everything.
Right.
Um, it's really fascinating. That was also Christopher Doyle's real apartment. They it was just
Oh, really? That
fortuitous.
they shot it
Yeah.
in?
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah,
really? So it was
it
really
became a
off the
very
cuff.
popular yeah, it became a very popular tourist destination. People would just show up at Christopher Doyle's door and want pictures and talk to him and stuff. And it actually
Oh,
led to
that's
him
funny.
getting some jobs and yeah, but it's just a movie that's I think the spontaneity of its creation is felt so purely, you know, like in watching it. Like it translates so well because it is exactly what it is. Like it's not trying to be
Well,
spontaneous. It
and one thing
is.
that I think is interesting about Wong Kar-Wai, I was reading up on him a little bit. He doesn't allow his actors to rehearse. He's like the anti Mike Lee in that way. So he wants everything fresh, the first take, and so he does have more of this improvised style that I think is really here in particular. You can really see it. I think in some of his other films, the stylization makes you it kind of hides the fact that the films are so much
Hmm.
improvised, but in this film you really feel it in a good way, not improvised like, oh boy, why did like sometimes you see like comedies that they were like, yeah, Will Ferrell improvised a lot of his lines. They're like, yeah, we can tell because it was hit or miss, but it feels like they're discovering the characters as they go along in a really fresh kind of
Absolutely. Yeah.
interesting way. And I think you mentioned that they shot it chronologically, so that means like you can literally see the characters getting to know each other because the actors themselves are getting to know each other or getting to know their characters as they're moving through it. And it's very unusual for movies to be shot in the order of the scenes. Movies are
Absolutely.
usually shot out of order. So there's a
And that was
lot
Faye
about the
Wong's
making of
first
it. Yeah.
role. Yeah. So
Yeah, and
like you
she's
said, you can
so
really
good.
see her.
And the minute you see her in the little cafe where they meet, where she's working, your eyes are drawn to her. Like you're just,
Hmm.
it's not like just like,
Her
oh, she
body
was a pop
language is
star.
just
Yeah.
like it just draws you in so much. She has just like a way about her. I would call her like, you know, sort of a manic pixie dream girl type or whatever, but you know, without the negative associations because she's not like, you know, this object for the guy to fixate upon and, you know, change or
Well,
whatever.
she's fixated on him, which,
Yeah, she's
let's
fixated
face
on
it, we can
him.
see why, because
Yeah, I was like, it's Tony Leung, we all are.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
he's so handsome. But I also think it's funny that the this is one of the few Wong Kar-wai films where even some of the little side characters are kind of interesting. Often it's
mhm,
like the very much the romantic leads, but the little cafe owner, the older guy, he's really
yeah.
funny because he's always trying to set the cop up, and he's like, "What
Another
about
funny thing
her?
with
What about
that,
her?"
that was the stills photographer for Chungking Express. Wong Kar-wai just thought he was a great character and that he fit the role, and so he threw him in there.
Oh, really?
That
But he
Piggy Chan
wasn't
was
actually an
he's
actor.
not an actor. He was the stills photographer for that movie, and that's why you don't see him in any of the stills for that movie because
Oh,
he's
because he
behind
was
the
shooting
camera.
it. Yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really great on it. I didn't know that, so that's a
Hmm.
lot of
And that's
fun.
something that Wong Kar-wai started to do more like later in his career. Like that was his first instance of it, I think. Because another thing is he liked to take big stars and cast them, and that also contributes to the MTV idea or whatever. But like he'll take big stars again, like Faye Wong, who is already a Cantonese pop star, and put her in the role, and Tony Leung, who is already vetted. Andy Lau and Leslie Chung are two of the they're called the four heavenly kings. Because in Canto Pop in the 90s, they were so big, they contributed so much to that industry that like they set so many records. They were just super influential. So they were major stars already going into his movies. Um, but then he started doing things like that. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think he brings so much character to that movie. He's so fun. He's such a real person.
And
Yeah.
I think this movie was it a relatively, do you know if it was relatively successful for him?
It was. So he was really struggling after Ashes of Time because he couldn't, it was such a big project and it cost him so much. And he was hoping to make a quickie for cheap, and it did really, really well. It saved his company, Jet Tone, and set them up like for the future, and was very
Yeah, that's great.
influential, obviously.
Well, we should move on to Ashes of Time.
Yeah.
Speaking of a very different type of film. 1994, he makes Ashes of Time. Obviously, he was making this one before Chungking Express, but it's a like that is much opposite as you can get from that film. It's a ton of characters. It's huge. It's got this epic scale. I really was mad that I got stuck trying to introduce this one because I'm not going to even try to describe the plot. It is impossible from an American viewpoint like mine to try to, and I read 5 different articles about this movie and nobody was able to describe the plot. It's based on a book called The Legend of the Condor Heroes. I'm going to tell you that much. It's sort of like a prequel to that book, which I've never read or know anything about. And it's a bunch of there's a main guy who's kind of a hero, but a hero with lots of flaws, and there's different stories involving him with different characters, and it does bring back some of Wong Kar-Wai's favorite actors, Maggie Cheung, Tony Leung, etc. It's done in this style that I read about, which is like martial arts combined with swordplay.
Hmm. Wuxia.
Um, yes, thank you for saying it for me, Wuxia. And I don't know much about that style, but it's in typical Wong Kar-Wai fashion, though. It's really not a typical martial arts movie. There's actually very little martial arts, or when there is some, it's again slowed down in kind of a stylized way. So it's not what you expect from a martial arts movie. I don't really know how to describe this movie. I actually watched it twice, and I still don't understand the plot at all. I couldn't begin to tell you. Maybe you can try. You try describing the
Uh,
plot, Autumn. I'd like to see you try to
um,
describe the plot of this
you
movie because I
know,
read 5 major critics, including the New York Times, who was like, "I give up. I can't describe the plot."
I'm totally with you. I think I understood the plot at one point after reading someone else's summary. I also watched the movie twice. I watched the theatrical release and then the Redux that he released in 2008. I still don't get it entirely, but as far as I understand it, it's really, I think, the weakest of Wong Kar-Wai's films as far as like any central narrative, of course, because it's so hard to follow and etc.
But it's
But
gorgeous. I mean,
it's
you just
gorgeous.
watch it,
Yeah,
just look at it. I mean, I
it's
just at one
really
point I just
beautiful.
decided I was going to give up on trying to because for like the first 30 minutes I was trying to follow the plot and then I just gave up. So
Yeah.
put it on and just look at the pretty images is what I would say. I know we're
Absolutely. I
running out
think
of
it's
time
so
on this one,
funny
but it's
that,
just beautiful.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's funny that he had Sammo Hung do the fight choreography though, which like looked, I'm sure, incredible and everything in person, but then he processes the image so much that you can't even tell what's going on.
No, I had no idea. It's just blurry stuff happening on the screen during the fight sequence.
Hmm.
So I'm like, I don't know what's going on,
Yeah.
but it
On
looked
my
kind of
second
cool.
viewing, that worked a little better for me. I didn't care for it as much on the first because I like seeing what's happening. But
Yeah.
I think it does work to push it into the realm of like the mythological and to make it more, distance, and you appreciate the broader storytelling versus like the in the moment
Yeah.
pleasures.
It's really more about it's like just watching a beautiful painting for a couple of hours. It's not even a full
Hmm.
2 hour movie. So give it a shot anyway. It's incredibly hard to find. It's not in the Criterion box set, which I think it's because he does think it's probably one of his lesser movies, although it's actually one of his most beautiful looking movies. So that's kind of a hard one. But we're running out of time. So I want to thank you, Autumn, for being on the show once again. Glad to have you back anytime. And as always, go to our YouTube page and hit that subscribe button and check out all the different places we can be watched. You can find that on our website. As always, have a great day and great movies.
Bye.